Item today is Tuesday, September 26th, 2023. Our guest today, our very special guest today, is the world-renowned Professor John Mearsheimer. Professor Mearsheimer is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. His PhD is from Cornell University. He is on the faculty of the University of Chicago, arguably the most demanding academic institution in the country. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on the geopolitics of our day. Your humble anchor, your humble host, has been a fan of Professor Mearsheimer's for many years, and I am deeply grateful that he's able to join us today, as are, I know, nearly all of you. So, Professor Mearsheimer, welcome here. Thank you very much for giving us your time today.
My pleasure, Andrew.
You have written extensively on the Ukraine war. You've spoken extensively on the Ukraine war. Tell us how it is that the fault for the Ukraine war coming about lies with the West and not with Moscow.
Well, there are two different interpretations of what caused this war. One is that Vladimir Putin was an imperialist. He was an expansionist, and he was bent on creating a greater Russia. And the reason that he invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 was that he wanted to conquer all of it, incorporate it into Russia, and then he was going to move on to conquer other states in Eastern Europe. This is clearly the conventional wisdom in the West, and it's obvious that this is the conventional wisdom because it portrays Vladimir Putin as the bad guy. This was, in this account, an unprovoked attack.
This is the theory espoused by the so-called neocons and by the globalists in Western Europe and the globalists in the American State Department.
Yes, and that probably includes about 95%, if not 99% of the foreign policy establishment.
So I am speaking to an iconoclast.
I'm sad to say that in this case, that's true. Because the truth is, Andrew, there is virtually no evidence to support that conventional wisdom. All the evidence is that what caused this war was the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key element of that strategy was to make Ukraine a part of NATO. And I would note that Jens Stoltenberg, who is the NATO Secretary General, has just said that that was the cause of the war. It's right. The first time that anybody in the West has spoken the truth. But nobody wants to hear this, despite the fact that Stoltenberg said it, because it portrays us as being principally responsible for the war, which is a way of saying we have blood on our hands.
And to advance an untruth of this magnitude, the American Congress is willing to spend $113 billion. The President of the United States is willing to commit to the killing of Ukrainian and Russian youth.
I don't know what to say other than I agree with you. It's just hard to believe, truly hard to believe when you look at the suffering that's taking place, especially in Ukraine, that we were foolish enough to push NATO eastward into Ukraine when the Russians made it manifestly clear from the get-go that they would destroy Ukraine before they would let this happen.
Did the United States State Department, Defense Department, Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, not take into account the massive death and destruction that would occur almost exclusively because of Western military aid to Ukraine? Actually, let me hold that question. Did they not take into account how the Russians would react, knowledgeable as they were, of Jim Baker and President George H.W. Bush's promise, NATO will never move 1 inch eastward, how Russia would react to its having moved 800 miles eastward, Poland, and then trying to assimilate Ukraine? What did they expect President Putin to do?
Well, as best I can tell from the available evidence, they expected President Putin to attack Ukraine. There is hardly any evidence that we took serious steps to prevent this war in January or February of 2022. It's actually quite remarkable when you look at the record how little we did, if anything, to prevent the war. So I think we expected the Russians to attack. And I believe that we thought we could defeat the Russians. And the key to our success would be twofold. First, we thought the Ukrainians, who we had trained and armed, would fight quite well. But most importantly, our sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees very quickly. That was the great miscalculation that we made. The sanctions didn't work, but we thought they would work, and we thought that was the war-winning weapon.
We'll put aside the constitutional, dubious nature of the sanctions. The President Biden could just say to the people importing Stolichnaya, it was $100,000 worth of Stolichnaya vodka at Port Newark, but the people that imported it couldn't get paid because it had to go through a Russian bank and come from a Russian company in St. Petersburg. This is one of many, many examples. Put that aside. Did they actually have economists advise them that the sanctions would weaken Russia? And do they recognize that the sanctions have had the opposite effect? Look at the success, or the what appears to be the success, or the popularity, I should say, at this point, of BRICS.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's manifestly clear at this time to almost everybody, including the people in the Biden administration, that the sanctions did not work. And in fact, to the extent that the sanctions are really hurting any countries, those are the countries in Western Europe, especially the Germans. So if anything, the sanctions have backfired. But your question is, what were we thinking going into this conflict? Did we have economists who paid careful attention to the question of whether or not sanctions would work? My bet, and we don't have access to the inside records, but my bet is we did not pay serious attention to that question, and we just assumed that sanctions would work. As you know, the United States is sanctions happy. We're sanctioning more than half the world at this point in time. We think it's a tremendously effective weapon, and that we can use it to coerce other countries, or if we get into a war with them, defeat them. But the fact is, if you look carefully at the record of sanctions, they usually don't work. And against a country like Russia, it was not likely that they would work. And of course, they haven't.
When the Western leaders speak with each other, do they utter what Secretary General Stoltenberg, either intentionally or mistakenly, uttered out loud, that we caused this? Is Tony Blinken saying to his opposite numbers in Paris or Berlin or London, we got to get out of this because we're not going to prevail militarily? Because their public statements are about as harsh and as can be, and it's hard to believe that they believe what they're saying, Professor.
I believe in Blinken's case that he really does believe it. He almost has to believe it. Otherwise, he would have to face up to the fact that he is one of the principal causes of this war. So I think he believes it. I don't think he's terribly smart either. I would imagine that Jake Sullivan is more sophisticated based on my dealings with him, and he understands there's a large element of truth in what Stoltenberg had to say. But at this point in time, the establishment is going to push very hard to continue purveying the conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom is designed to make us look like the good guys and Putin look like the bad guy. So I would not expect them to take their foot off the accelerator on this one.
But you have written that Ukraine will for sure lose this war. And I guess you're telling us that the people who decide how many bullets we send and how much cash we send, and indirectly how many human beings will die, reject that argument or fear that argument and want to delay it?
Well, they thought for a long while that there was a clever strategy that we could employ to defeat the Russians. They looked at these two tactical victories that the Russians had last year in Kharkiv and Kherson, and they figured that with this counteroffensive, which was launched on 4 June of this year, The Ukrainians would deliver the Russians a hammer blow, push them to the negotiating table, and the Ukrainians in the West would be in the driver's seat and would get a really good deal. This has obviously not happened. The balance of power has shifted over the course of 2023, and we're now in a situation where the Ukrainians are doomed to lose. There's just, in my opinion, no way they can win unless the Russians completely collapse. And there's no sign that that's going to happen. If you look at the population size of Russia compared to the population size of Ukraine, you realize that the Russians will produce many more soldiers than the Ukrainians, which really matters in a war of attrition. Furthermore, the Russians have much more artillery than the Ukrainians have, and they're getting even more artillery than the Ukrainians have over time. And artillery matters enormously in a war of attrition. So given the artillery balance, given the population balance, or I should say imbalances, it's hard to see how the Russians don't win this war.